Howdy friends, I'm Conrad and welcome to Bad Guy Breakdowns, the series where we look at the most iconic villains to grace the silver screen. Let's get into the villainy. Today we're talking about Once Upon a Time in the West, Sergio Leone's triumphant return to the Western genre. And specifically, we're talking about a villain played by the most white meat of good guys. This is like Father Christmas turning heel. Chris Pratt going from Andy in Parks and Rec to the guy he currently plays in every movie. Of course, I'm talking about Henry Fonda, a man who by 1968 had played characters spanning the entire spectrum of heroism. If you wanted a stoic, noble good guy in your movie anytime from 1940 onwards, Henry was the man to call. Leone had turned down a number of westerns after wrapping up his Dollars trilogy with The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. United Artists, who produced all three of those movies, had offered him projects with Charlton Heston and Kirk Douglas, but he refused them all. It wasn't until Paramount came calling with a sizable budget and the prospect of working with Fonda that Leone was tempted back to the Old West. To conceive a story, Leone put the call out to two young Italian filmmakers, Dario Argento and Bernardo Bertolucci. Now, those names may or may not immediately mean anything to you, so I'll just say that in the 60 years following this movie, both of these two went on to become legends of Italian cinema. Argento as the master of giallo horror and Bertolucci as a creator of neo-realist classics like The Conformist. Basically, this was the equivalent of Batman asking Jesus and Goku for help writing a cowboy story. Look, it sounded funny in my head, okay? Rounding out the cast would be Charles Bronson as the hero Harmonica, taking the role after Clint Eastwood had turned it down, Claudia Cardinale as the heroine Jill, and the gentlemanly stage actor Jason Robards as the roughneck criminal Cheyenne. Numerous technical staff returned from Leone's previous westerns, including, of course, the legendary Ennio Morricone composing the score. This last one's particularly important because every one of these characters has a specific theme, and the music is used to announce their arrivals as well as underscoring moments of focus on that character. A lot of people remember Morricone for the work he did on The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, and rightfully so, but for my money this is his best western score. It's emotive, stirring and melodramatic in all the right ways, and it elevates the characters to an almost mythical level. But we're here to talk about one of them in particular. I'm going to come back to Frank's theme a bit later once we've had an opportunity to get to know the characters he'll be going up against. So for the time being, let's imagine the year is 1968. Henry Fonda was a huge name. He was in his mid-60s and was considered an elder statesman of the profession of acting in Hollywood. But it was still a big risk to cast him against type as a villain. No one had ever seen him play one before. Could he even do it? Would audiences pay to see him as the bad guy? These were the gambles that Paramount and Leone were taking when they decided that they absolutely had to have Fonda and his piercing baby blue eyes as not just a villain, but one of the most evil characters ever depicted in a popular western. And, unfortunately, the answer to that last question was no, not really. On release, the film struggled financially and received only average critical reviews. It was accused of being too long, even after Paramount cut it down by 20 minutes for the theatrical release. And critics seemed to view it as a fun but largely forgettable movie.
At preview in America, it was an absolute disaster. I mean, everyone just thought, in fact, the headline in Time magazine was "Tedium in the Tumbleweed."
Opinion on it did begin to shift after its release, to the point where it's regarded as a masterpiece today. But I think it's fair to say that even at the time, no one was faulting the performance of Fonda for its failure. Because his menacing turn as Frank is immediately captivating, coming as it does in one of Hollywood's all-time great character introductions. But to get there, we need to meet another character first. Once Upon a Time in the West opens in a fashion that is typical of Leone's westerns. an agonisingly quiet scene punctuated only by the banging of a door or the creaking of a hinge. We meet 3 characters at a train station who are what I like to call dead men walking because they look like they're ready for a fight, but none of them are the hero. But in fact, all 3 of these actors were seasoned veterans of westerns. A story repeated by Leone's biographer claims that Clint Eastwood, Eli Wallach and Lee Van Cleef were offered these roles as a sort of joke, so that the director could gun down the stars of his previous cowboy movie and dramatically announce a departure from that series. Whatever the truth is, the casting here emphasises a key theme of Once Upon a Time in the West, that this movie is at once an homage to the westerns of old, while at the same time a critique of their slightly simplistic ideologies. The almost complete lack of dialogue amplifies the tension of the scene to almost unbearable levels until Harmonica is revealed on the other side of a departing train, where he asks the 3 men if Frank has come with them. Their mockery is met with one of the coldest lines I've ever heard anyone say in a movie.
Looks like we're shy of 1 horse.
You brought too many.
That is Woody Strode though. He was in a lot of John Ford westerns. I don't know, maybe these guys have a chance. Oops! Oh, okay, well that's the end of them. Leone uses the same technique of long, unbroken silence to build tension in the introduction to Frank, where he stalks and murders a father and his children as they prepare a meal outdoors. They're expecting the arrival of Claudia Cardinale's character Jill, though we haven't met her yet, while their killers are dressed in dusters to implicate Cheyenne's gang in the crime, though we haven't met him yet either. The opening, from lights up to first shots being fired, is 13 minutes. And you would be forgiven for thinking that Leone would ease up a little here. It would be crazy to have 2 long, quiet scenes like that in a row, right? Wrong! Don't question Sergio Leone. This one is about 10 minutes long, so it is a little shorter in fairness, but not by much, and it certainly doesn't feel it as McBain, his 2 sons and daughter toil in the dusty heat, occasionally staring out into the wilderness whenever the birds ominously stop chirping. To me, implying that Frank or one of his boys might be a nature wizard of some kind? Or maybe a druid? It's unclear.
Oh, Danny boy, the pipes are calling.
Really, Maureen? You're going to sing Danny Boy right now? Do you want to get shot? I warned you! Leone and cinematographer Tonino Delicoli produced some moments of stunning photography for this movie, and this is one of them, as they use a tracking shot with foliage in front of the subject, McBain, to create foreground parallax, which gives his desperate sprint to his daughter's body a depth and sense of pace. After all 3 of McBain, Maureen and his eldest son Patrick are dead, we get what I like to call a motherfucking Ennio Morricone moment, as the youngest McBain son, Timmy, emerges outside to the chaos and the score comes to life with electric guitars. Oh yeah, now it's a western! That's the theme song of our hero, and the use of it here is haunting as this young boy stares at his now dead family with a mixture of terror, confusion and maybe a little defiance on his face, as trenchcoat wearing gunmen emerge from the bushes. Why is Harmonica's song playing when he isn't in the scene? I think it's because Leone wants us to associate the character with violent childhood trauma, and to imply that Frank has been doing this to children up and down the frontier for years. In another life, Timmy could have been turned into another harmonica, but not this one. The shots of the gang marching towards him, then the cuts to and over the shoulder of Frank which pans and rotates to reveal Henry Fonda's smiling face and blue eyes is an all-time great character introduction. The moment where I imagine thousands of people in cinemas across the world in 1968, who probably hadn't seen the trailer for this movie, sat up and screamed, "That's Henry Fonda? The guy who played Wyatt Earp?" And this almost didn't happen the way we saw it in the movie. While preparing for the role, Henry Fonda had assumed that Leone would want him to transform himself physically to appear more villainous, and had contacts made to change his eye colour as well as growing a beard. But when Leone saw him, he demanded that he revert to his regular appearance, because the revelation that this murderous bastard was the Honourable Henry Fonda was exactly the effect he wanted.
And Sergio Leone had cast me because he could imagine at this moment the audience saying, Jesus Christ, it's Henry Fonda!
One of his idiot henchmen calls him by name, forcing him to kill the boy, though Frank's expression shifting from a smile to a frown and then back to a smile suggests that it doesn't weigh all that heavily on his conscience. And the idea of the emotional price that all of the three male leads in this movie will pay for their actions is one that requires a little more analysis. We've heard harmonica's theme now. It sounds like this. But what about the others? Well, Jill's is easy, as it appears immediately after the introduction of Frank. It's a wordless, peaceful bit of music which swells into life as the town of Flagstaff is revealed in a crane shot that took half a day to achieve. And Cheyenne's isn't too hard to spot either. It's this roguish, almost jaunty tune played on banjos and a piano that evokes images of a man who can't settle down with the clip-clop of horses' hooves. The first time we hear it is in a wonderful scene where Jason Robards emerges into an inn after a storm of shouting and gunfire outside, meets harmonica and demands that a bystander free him from his chains. As an interesting aside, a lot of the external shots in this movie were done in Monument Valley, while the interiors were split between Almira, Spain and the Cinecittà studios in Rome. So when Cheyenne emerges into the saloon here, the dust that flies in after him was actually imported from America, because the red sand of Monument Valley wasn't available in the more bleached, yellowy area of Spain where this was filmed.
In fact, he imported bags of dust from Monument Valley.
This was one of the scenes that was cut by Paramount when the previews for the movie came back negative. A decision I can't understand. It's a great introduction to Cheyenne and has him meeting Jill and harmonica at the same time. He's a character who was badly treated by the original Paramount cut, something we'll come back to later. Frank's theme is a little more complicated, because unless you're really listening out for it, you might just assume you're hearing harmonica's theme again. Can you hear the difference? I'll give you a hint. Frank is a character who is utterly unburdened by the guilt of his crimes. There is only one individual in this movie who he ever expresses remorse for potentially having to kill, and that's Jill when he takes her prisoner, and is based on nothing more than finding her attractive. So why does this theme sound so much calmer than harmonica's? The answer, I think, is that Leone and Morricone wanted to convey the idea that he and harmonica are two sides of the same coin. Men driven by a singular vision who use violence as a tool to reach their ends. Frank's quest for financial gain through Mr. Morton and harmonica's quest for revenge. But while Frank has undoubtedly done the more awful things of the two, his version of the theme is serene, whereas harmonica's sounds aggressive and haunted. These two themes tell us about the price these men have paid for the lives they've lived. Frank is unmoved by conscience, he simply doesn't have one and is completely at peace with what he's done, whereas harmonica's soul is tainted by the violence he has committed in his quest for revenge. It's why the ending of the movie, which we'll get to shortly, is so tinged with tragedy. Speaking of things Frank is unburdened by, competent help is one. Harmonica guns down two of his men at Sweetwater before both he and Cheyenne follow another, Wobbles, back to Mr. Morton's train. He's our traditional evil businessman and wants Jill and Sweetwater out of the way so he can continue his railroad west before he dies. Frank has been his heavy for some time. I'm only mentioning this scene for two reasons. One, to show Frank pulling a gun on Mr. Morton, a man who seconds earlier he had called a friend, to show that he is completely mistrustful of everyone.
You're gonna need somebody more and more every day to stay near you. Like a friend.
Or like a partner.
And two, to include one of Frank's own amazing one-liners.
How can you trust a man that wears both a belt and suspenders? Man can't even trust his own pants.
He kills this man a few minutes later, by the way, by shooting him a couple of times, including in the belt. never let it be said that Frank doesn't understand the value of a good visual gag. The subsequent rescue sequence where Cheyenne takes out a train full of bad guys by clambering over the roof and putting his gun in his boot to pretend it's his foot is not really relevant to Frank in any way. But it is entertaining, and one of the more funny scenes in the movie, employing literal toilet humour. Cheyenne is great for that. He brings levity and a good amount of heart to the story. His relationship with Jill is, for me, the most believable of the three gunslingers. As the movie progresses, all of them are posited as potential suitors for the widow, but I never really buy Harmonica as romantically interested in her, despite a pretty difficult to watch scene between the two of them at Sweetwater where he derobes her. If we're being honest, spaghetti westerns have never been all that forward-thinking in their depictions of women, unfortunately. And Leone had to be challenged to even include a fully developed woman by fellow storywriter Bernardo Bertolucci before he would consider it.
You face a new challenge. Let's have a woman character in your film.
Harmonica's advances towards Jill are about a power dynamic. He wants her to stay and fight for Sweetwater because it serves his plan for revenge and is willing to force her to do so. And the same can be said of Frank's relationship with her, where to him she represents a fantasy of him settling down as owner of Sweetwater with her as his wife, to live a life of wealth and debauchery. Neither man actually seems to care about her the way that Cheyenne does. Harmonica may convince Cheyenne and his boys that building the station before the train rolls through, thereby fulfilling Jill's claim on it, is the right thing to do, but it's Cheyenne and friends who do most of the building. Not to mention a genuinely touching moment where Robard stares wistfully out of a window at Sweetwater, claiming that his reason for doing this is because it's the first thing Jill will see when she gets back from Frank's clutches. To me, Cheyenne is actually the only one of the three who wants to make Jill happy. He is a romantic soul. It's just a shame that he's also a thief and a murderer. Westerns normally only end one way, with a bunch of people shooting at each other. And Leone's penchant for long, tense scenes makes these short bursts of action all the more exhilarating. We've already seen a couple, the shootout at the station, Frank's introduction, and the rescue of Harmonica on Mr. Morton's train. But as Once Upon a Time in the West heads into its third hour, what lies ahead of us is its most complete and extended action sequence, as well as the emotional climactic duel between two of our main characters. As sure as death and taxes, the rich white guy in a movie like this can be relied upon to fall out with his heavy, usually outright betraying him. And after a brief frisson with Jill where he considers marrying her, Frank instead decides to force her to sell Sweetwater to him under threat of death, which Morton isn't an enormous fan of. Unfortunately for both of them, Harmonica turns up with Cheyenne in chains and turns him in for a $5,000 bounty, which sees him shipped off to Yuma, which Cheyenne isn't an enormous fan of.
There were no dollars in them days.
But sons of bitches, yeah.
Damn, the rare biblical burn. And Harmonica then uses the bounty to buy the land himself, which Frank isn't an enormous fan of. So no one is happy. Or I guess Harmonica and Jill are happy? For a bit, anyway.
Pick any method you like, just make the deal.
All of this leads to two action sequences, one that we see and one that we don't. Mr. Morton pays off Frank's boys to betray him, which results in an unlikely alliance between Frank and Harmonica, who opts to protect his mortal enemy from his treacherous underlings so that he can kill him later. It gives us the one moment of Frank absolutely cutting loose as a gunslinger and really serves to underline just how good at this line of work he is. Not to mention this amazing exchange between Harmonica and Jill.
You saved his life.
I didn't let them kill him, and that's not the same thing.
I love that Frank rolls up to this scene in the saloon wearing all black. Previously in the movie, we've seen him in lighter coloured outfits, which don't conceal his murderous nature, but do serve to obscure it slightly. Here, his character has become a visual metaphor. He's walking death. We don't yet know whose, but we can be certain that this movie is going to end with at least one of our three gunslingers dying. It might be slightly stating the obvious for a cowboy movie given they pretty much all end that way, but Once Upon a Time in the West is elegiac. It's a remembrance of a bygone era, and as such, every step Leone takes to elevate what is happening on screen to the realm of metaphor and legend serves the power of the elegy more. Frank's shift in costume is one such example. Plenty of cowboys before Frank have worn all black to indicate they are villains. Henry Fonda's probably even killed a couple himself. But here, Frank is not just a black hat cowboy, he has become the idea of the man in black, the villainous legend from which all black hats were drawn. And as we hurtle towards a final confrontation between him and Harmonica, the clash becomes as much about a battle for the spirit of the West as their own personal rivalry. It's notable as well that Cheyenne is a bystander in this clash. The idea of the romantic bandit that he personifies can't exist in either vision of the West, which I think really encapsulates the tragedy of his character, because no matter who wins, he is doomed. And speaking of Cheyenne, the action sequence we didn't see was him being rescued from the train to Yuma by his gang, who then staged an attack on Mr. Morton's train. We only witnessed the aftermath via Frank finding Morton on the verge of death and both gangs utterly wiped out, with a lovely tracking shot along the outside of the train as he walks through it. As Harmonica waits for Frank, Cheyenne arrives and heads inside, where he and Jill share a brief fantasy of what it might be like in another life where they could live together. She makes the coffee, he shaves, and admits that
You can't imagine how happy it makes a man to see a woman like you.
And then Frank arrives, Harmonica stops whittling, and the two briefly share a moment of seeing eye to eye about their non-existent futures.
Nothing matters now, not the land, not the money, not the woman. I came here to see you.
And then the talking is done, and what do we get in place of the talk? Ennio motherfucking Morricone! This scene still gives me goosebumps. The use of incredible deep focus wide shots and extreme close-ups, the way the strings enter the score just as Frank drops his jacket, the sweeping melodrama of it all. This right here is the final battle for the soul of the West, and no matter who wins, both men know that their way of life is done, and it fills the scene with such a raw sense of fatalistic emotion. And then, using one of the most extreme zooms I have ever seen, we find out exactly why Harmonica hates Frank so much. Because somewhere in the past he forced him to hold his brother on his shoulders or else let him be hanged by the noose around his neck. His brother decides he would rather commit suicide than allow Harmonica to suffer and kicks him away. And immediately we cut back to the present, where Frank gets one extra hole through the chest for all of his crimes before dropping his gun, falling to the ground, and having a harmonica symbolically placed in his mouth before dying. You live by the sword, you die by the sword, big guy. But it isn't just Frank who has died here. Harmonica has given up his identity to complete his quest for revenge, and probably his soul too. And Cheyenne, well, we'll get to him. One of the saddest scenes in this movie is him lamenting that neither he nor Harmonica can stay with Jill at Sweetwater.
You're sort of a handsome man.
But I'm not the right man.
He's accepted that this is nothing but a fantasy and must move on. In Harmonica's case, he does just that. In Cheyenne's case, it depends on the version you've seen. In the original release, Cheyenne and Harmonica are seen riding over the hills away from Sweetwater, and the movie ends. In Leone's version, Cheyenne gets just out of sight of the town before revealing that he was shot in the gut by Morton during the attack on the train before dying. At which point Harmonica puts his body over his horse and leads them all out of town. It's a much grimmer ending and far more in keeping with the overarching theme of a way of life that is coming to an end, because, in the end, Harmonica, Cheyenne, and Frank were all heading to the same place, the last of their kind. And that's Once Upon a Time in the West. Many people argue that it gave the identity back to the American Western by reanalyzing many of the tropes that had come to make them feel stale. And Frank, as the black-hatted bad guy who isn't all that different from our hero, is as good an example of this as any. Henry Fonda's chilling performance ranks among any other Western character you care to compare it to, and probably any other character full stop. Thank you for joining us on Bad Guy Breakdowns. If you could leave a like, that'd be much appreciated, and be sure to join us next time as we delve into the brutal fantasy world of Conan the Barbarian and James Earl Jones's evil sorcerer Thulsa Doon. Till then, I've been Conrad, and I'll see you next time.